It's June 13th, 1381, and a 14-year-old boy named King Richard II is staring out over the Thames at a sight no English monarch had ever seen before. 60,000 armed commoners camped outside London, and they want to talk to him personally. 3 days earlier, this had all seemed impossible. England was still recovering from the Black Death, which had wiped out a third of the population a few decades earlier. And for the peasants who survived, this horror had accidentally created an opportunity. With so many laborers dead, the ones left standing suddenly had leverage. Landowners were desperate for workers, and wages started climbing for the first time in generations. Peasants who had spent their whole lives tied to a lord's land began demanding better pay, and some even left for other estates offering more money. Naturally, the nobility hated this, so Parliament passes the Statute of Laborers, a law that literally freezes wages at pre-plague levels and makes it illegal for peasants to leave their village to seek better work. It's an attempt to legally force the country back into the way things were before the plague, as if 30% of the population hadn't just died. The peasants are furious, but they grit their teeth and endure it. Then the crown decides it needs more money to fund the ongoing war with France, and it introduces a poll tax, a flat tax charged per person regardless of income. This means a starving farmhand pays the exact same tax as a wealthy landowner. It's the third poll tax in 4 years, and this time the country has had enough. In the village of Fobbing, Essex, a royal tax collector named John Bampton arrives to investigate reports of tax evasion. He gets an unexpected answer. The villagers, led by a man later remembered as Thomas Baker, drive him out of town with force. Word spreads fast and other villages join in. Within days, this local skirmish turns into a full-blown uprising across Essex and Kent, and a preacher named John Ball, who had spent years being imprisoned for radical sermons about equality, starts traveling between the rebel camps, asking crowds a question that becomes their rallying cry: when Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In other words, nobody was born a lord, it's all made up. In Kent, the rebels find a leader. His name is Wat Tyler, and almost nothing is known about his life before this moment, which only adds to his legend. What we do know is that he's a skilled organizer, and under his command, the Kent rebels storm Rochester Castle and free the prisoners inside. Then they march on Canterbury, and the mob breaks into the cathedral itself and demands the monks elect a new archbishop because the current one, Simon Sudbury, also happens to be the Lord Chancellor who helped push through the hated poll tax. Then the rebels do something almost nobody expects. Instead of raiding the countryside and going home, they march on London. By June 12th, tens of thousands of rebels are camped at Blackney, just outside the city walls. And here's the detail that should terrify the royal court more than anything else. London's gates open for them. Sympathetic citizens inside the city, fed up with the same taxes and corruption, let the rebels in without a fight. The mob pours through the streets, but this isn't mindless chaos. They have targets. They burn the Savoy Palace, the lavish home of John of Gaunt, the king's uncle and the most hated man in the government, but they don't loot it. Eyewitness accounts describe rebels throwing the palace's gold and jewels into the Thames rather than stealing them, and executing one of their own men on the spot for pocketing a silver goblet. This wasn't a robbery, it was a message. We're not thieves, we're here for justice. They break open the Fleet and Newgate prisons, freeing everyone inside, and they hunt down the men they blame most for their suffering. They find the treasurer, John Legge, and lawyers connected to the poll tax, and they execute them in the streets. Foreign merchants, particularly Flemish immigrants blamed for undercutting English wages, are dragged out and killed as well. Trapped inside the Tower of London with his closest advisors, 14-year-old King Richard II makes a decision that shocks his own council. He agrees to ride out and meet the rebels face-to-face at Mile End. Standing before tens of thousands of armed peasants, the boy king does something remarkable. He agrees to their demands, he promises to abolish serfdom, to pardon everyone involved in the revolt, and to end the hated poll tax. Wat Tyler is right there in the crowd, and for a moment it looks like the peasants have actually won. But while Richard is out at Mile End charming half the rebel army with promises, a splinter group storms the Tower of London itself, which had been left lightly guarded. Inside, they find Archbishop Simon Sudbury and Treasurer Robert Hales hiding in the chapel. Both men are dragged out to Tower Hill and beheaded, their heads mounted on pikes and paraded through London. The next day, June 15th, Richard agrees to a second meeting with the remaining rebels at Smithfield, and this time, Wat Tyler rides forward personally to present a new list of demands, including the abolition of all lordship, except the king's own, and the redistribution of church wealth. As he speaks, accounts describe him acting with startling casualness in front of the king. calling for water to rinse his mouth and behaving in the eyes of the royal party with disrespectful familiarity toward a monarch. Then everything goes wrong at once. The Lord Mayor of London, William Walworth, either provoked by an insult or simply seizing the opportunity, draws a dagger and stabs Wat Tyler. Rebel archers in the crowd raise their bows ready to unleash chaos, and in this single instant the entire revolt hangs in the balance. And this is where 14-year-old Richard II does something either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless. He rides out alone toward the armed and furious crowd and shouts, "You shall have no captain but me!" The rebels, confused and leaderless, hesitate, and that hesitation is fatal. Royal forces are quietly gathered, and the crowd disperses, believing their young king will honor his word. He does not. Within weeks, the promises made at Mile End are declared void. Richard's council argues a king cannot legally free serfs or overturn feudal law on a whim, especially one extracted under duress. Royal justices are sent throughout Essex and Kent to hunt down the revolt's remaining leaders. John Ball, the preacher who had asked the crowds who the first gentleman was, is captured, and he is hanged, drawn, and quartered in front of the king himself. Roughly 1,500 rebels are executed in the crackdown that follows. The Peasants' Revolt of 1381 fails to achieve a single one of its official demands. Serfdom is not abolished. The poll tax returns. The men responsible for crushing the revolt keep their titles and lands. And yet something had changed that could not be undone. No English king ever again attempted to introduce a poll tax remotely like it for centuries, and serfdom, while not formally abolished, quietly began fading out over the following decades anyway, as landowners, having just watched what happens when peasants are pushed too far, found it safer to simply pay wages instead. The Whiskey Rebellion. It's July 16, 1794, and a group of roughly 500 armed farmers is marching toward the mansion of a man named John Neville just outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Neville is the regional tax inspector for the brand new United States government, and today the farmers intend to make sure he never collects another cent from them again. To understand why, you have to go back 3 years to when Alexander Hamilton, the country's first Secretary of the Treasury, is trying to solve a massive problem. The United States is drowning in debt from the Revolutionary War, and Hamilton needs a way to pay it off. His solution is an excise tax on whiskey, one of the very first taxes levied by the new federal government. This might sound reasonable enough back in the wealthy port cities on the East Coast, but out on the western frontier of Pennsylvania, whiskey isn't just a drink, it's practically currency. Roads out here are so bad that farmers can't feasibly haul raw grain to market. It would rot or get crushed in transit. But if you distill that grain into whiskey, it becomes compact, doesn't spoil, and is easy to trade. Whiskey is how frontier farmers pay their debts, their rent, even each other's labor. Taxing it isn't just an inconvenience, it's taxing their entire economy at its source. And the tax isn't even structured fairly. Large-scale distillers back east pay a lower rate per gallon, while small frontier farmers running modest stills get hit with a much higher effective rate. To add insult to injury, anyone accused of violating the tax law has to travel all the way to Philadelphia to stand trial, a trip that could take a farmer away from his land for weeks and cost more than the fine itself. Farmers begin refusing to pay almost immediately. Tax collectors sent into the region are tarred and feathered, a genuinely brutal punishment involving scalding tar poured onto bare skin, followed by a coating of feathers causing severe burns. Some collectors are dragged from their homes at night, others have their offices burned to the ground. A folk hero-esque of resistance grows, and men calling themselves followers of Tom the Tinker leave threatening notes for anyone caught cooperating with tax officials, and if the warnings aren't heeded, their stills get destroyed. John Neville, despite being a wealthy local landowner and a war veteran himself, has taken the job of federal tax inspector, and this makes him public enemy number one in the region. In 1794, when a federal marshal arrives to serve legal papers to farmers who refuse to pay, an armed crowd surrounds him in Neville's house, demanding the marshal hand over his documents. Neville, from inside the house, fires a warning shot, and the standoff escalates into a full gunfight. Neville is besieged. The following day, roughly 500 armed rebels return to finish the job, and this time they come prepared to burn Neville's entire estate to the ground. Neville has hastily reinforced his home with about 10 soldiers from a nearby garrison. As the rebels demand Neville turn himself over, gunfire breaks out again. One of the rebel leaders, James McFarland, a former Revolutionary War officer himself, is shot and killed while trying to negotiate a temporary ceasefire flag of truce. Enraged at his death, the mob sets the outbuildings on fire, and Neville's soldiers, seeing their situation as hopeless, eventually surrender. Neville himself manages to escape and flees toward Pittsburgh. McFarland's death transforms the rebellion overnight. What had been scattered local resistance becomes a full regional uprising. Thousands of armed men, estimates suggest as many as 7,000, gather at Braddock's Field outside Pittsburgh, and for a moment it genuinely looks like an armed insurrection against the United States government is forming. Less than a decade after the Constitution had even been ratified, word reaches President George Washington, and this puts him in an extraordinary position. He is the only sitting U.S. president in history to personally lead troops into the field to suppress a rebellion. Washington, still remembering how fragile the young nation's authority truly was, decides he cannot let this stand. If the federal government can't even enforce a tax law, what's stopping every state and territory from simply ignoring Washington whenever they disagree with it? Washington invokes the Militia Act and personally rides out at the head of nearly 13,000 federalized militia troops, a force larger than the army he'd commanded for most of the Revolutionary War. Facing an actual army marching toward them, the rebellion collapses almost instantly. Most of the rebels simply melt back into the countryside and go home rather than face federal troops. By the time Washington's forces arrive in western Pennsylvania, there's no one left to fight. Soldiers round up around 150 suspected rebels, though evidence against most of them is thin, and only 2 men are ever convicted of treason. Washington, in an act of political calculation as much as mercy, pardons both of them. The whiskey tax itself remains deeply unpopular and largely uncollectible in the region for years afterward, and it is eventually repealed entirely in 1802 under President Thomas Jefferson, whose party had opposed it from the start. In the end, the government proved it had the power to enforce its laws, but the farmers also proved something. Push people too far, and they will burn your house down before they hand over $1.